Thanks. We really appreciate your contributions and you fall in the long line of very worthy Leontief lectures and Leontief Prize recipients. We do have time now for some questions.
Question for Francis. Could you talk a little bit about the cycle of the violent conflict increasing the horizontal inequalities because of security reasons? Then the inequalities will increase because those that are in power must do things to secure the country, and that must create. So how does that cycle continue, and how does one break it?
Professor Adelson, is part of your motivation in hope in writing your book to refocus the economic profession's focus on the ideas of Hirschman, to kind of drag it away from much of its current direction?
For Professor Adelman, since you focus so much on Hirschman's early life, could you tell us what happened to his family in Europe? You talked about his leaving, but not the rest.
And one more.
For Professor Stewart, I was struck by the data that you put up for the United States versus for England, and noted that a large proportion of our prison population is Muslim, which is related to race. And you had earlier on talked about the fluid notion of identity and group identity for many of our prisoners. They become Muslim. So I'm just wondering whether you could make any comparison between the British experience of Muslims and the American experience of Muslims, and that kind of fluid nature of identity, how it changes.
All right, let's start with those.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the first one was on security. I think that the authorities probably overdo the security, but maybe let's assume that they don't and that they need to do it. It's still possible to take every policy towards social and economic and political representation and do that at the same time, so that the fundamental inequalities are reduced, and then the security. I think the security issue will be much diminished. I think that, but it is a world problem. This is the problem. I mean, you can do that in your own country, but also we need to do it overseas. And in Afghanistan, we're not very effective at doing the development, but the amount of money, for example, in Pakistan, if you take US aid to Pakistan, I think it's about 2/3 when I looked at it, maybe a bit out of date, but about 2/3 is on military issues, and only 1/3 on economic, and nothing about the inequalities within Pakistan and so on and so forth. And that is just a recipe. I'm not saying that the US alone can turn around Pakistan or even should turn around Pakistan, but it's not helping, because it's development in Pakistan, it's inequalities within Pakistan that needs to be addressed. And the military is just shouldn't be up there and up front. On the second issue about, US and... I have to say I'm a bit of an amateur on the US. I looked it up a bit because I felt that it was ridiculous to come here and talk to you just about Europe. But I see your point. I mean, I know that this does happen in the US. I think it happens less in the UK. I think what happens, I don't think it's the people who are completely non-Islam who become Islamic. It may be a bit. I think basically what happens is that within Islam there are a lot of people who are sort of quite unreligious and, not particularly extreme, but they become extremized, so to speak, so that their identities change, but within Islam, I think, more in Europe than is the case in the US. Less that people who weren't Islamic at all become Islamic.
Thank you for the questions. First, on the economics profession, it is my intention to intervene in the current history of the economics profession. All I would say is that if Albert Hirschman couldn't do it, I can't. And it would be a hubris on my part to think that the book could accomplish that. Now, the book has some normative, very implicit claims to it. As a historian, that's what we do. I would say that there's a spirit of, or a style, a cognitive style, as Hirschman himself would have put it, that I am trying to cast some light on, that has a few everyday practices. The emphasis on complexity, the emphasis on, one of his favorite words was trespassing across disciplines, across boundaries of all kinds, to look at objects from the outside in as well as the inside out, which is one of the reasons why he kept turning over a lot of his concepts like exit, voice, and loyalty. And he was very eclectic in the way he formulated his thinking. In the rush to get under the 20-minute wire, I did not talk about Hayek, so now I'll smuggle Hayek back in. While Hirschman is on the Italian front, this is in the autumn of 1945. The war is over in Italy. There's a bookstore in Rome that it's been over for a little while, and so life has started again in Italy, and he walks into a bookstore in Rome and finds a copy of The Road to Serfdom. And reads The Road to Serfdom and writes a letter to Sarah. And his letters from the front, and there's a whole genre of letter writing of soldiers from the front back to their wives that I've discovered is an amazing body of literature from the time we began to organize war. Men wrote these letters, and in the letter he describes to Sarah, and again, you have to remember how young this man is still at this stage. He says, I've fought in 3 armies now, 3 wars, and I hate armies. And I've been reading this book. It's called The Road to Serfdom, and it may be that I hate large. He has given me voice to understand why I don't like large organizations. And I bring in the Hayek story because people often think of Hirschman, that lump him into the left, and he was certainly progressive, but he was a lot more complex than that. He really believed in individualism, though he extolled the virtues of collective action. He was always trying to find ways of combining things. So, do I want to move economics? No. Do I want to urge us to think in innovative ways about finding solutions to the planet that allows us to step outside the dogma, the simplistic dogmas? Yes. The family in Europe. It was a relatively small family. Not many died at Auschwitz. A few did. His uncle, he shared a room with for a while in his house in Berlin, did get taken to Auschwitz. Most got out. If that's what were you getting at, how the Holocaust was, we don't know very much about his father's side of the family, for reasons I explore in the book. If you want, I can go into that in more detail, but he was of Ostjuden stock. He almost most certainly lost all of his family, but Albert had no access to that side of the family for complicated reasons. The mother's side of the family, most of them did escape, except for a few uncles and therefore some cousins. And the whole, if I can digress a little on the Jewish question, because he was an assimilated Jew, never self-identified as a Jew. He became a Jew by decree. And the Jewish question was always an awkward one for him, personally, because he believed in the universal, going back to the Weimar Republic, the universal values in cosmopolitanism, and he always thought that religion, going back to category divides, particularized people. The Holocaust, as a result, was always a very uncomfortable subject, and it was among the reasons why he did not like to talk about that chapter of his past.
Yes? Could we take another round of questions? Yeah, Eva?
Francis, I was thinking that on the subject of horizontal inequalities, of course, the very biggest one, which divides one half of the human race against the other, is gender. And it's hard to grasp how your thinking about horizontal inequalities fits this, because it's everywhere. So I'm just curious about how you've thought about that.
So I had a different question about horizontal inequalities. I was thinking about, it seemed to me that you said that, well, vertical inequalities are going to happen as a result of incentives. We're going to have them, whereas horizontal inequalities between groups are just plain bad, and we'd be better if we could cut it out. And it seems to me that if you have these vertical inequalities of income based on incentives, that group identity will inevitably form around them. People who have more money because they won on the incentive games will go on vacation together in nicer places, and they'll eat at nicer restaurants, and pretty soon they'll move into communities that they'll try to keep the people at the bottom out of, and there will start to be a group identity. And so I wonder, at what point does the vertical inequality create a horizontal inequality, or where really is the line between the two?
I want to ask a question that relates to both of you. One of the big horizontal inequalities, since Albert Hirschman worked on Latin America, one of the really big inequalities is the inequality of ethnicity, indigenous people in Latin America. And so one question is, to what extent did Albert Hirschman really want to tackle that? I know a lot of his writing, but I don't see him as a real voice for trying to deal with that. And then the other question is, with democratization, the role of indigenous people has changed dramatically in Latin America. And so I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that particular kind of horizontal inequality. And is there some kind of hope in the Latin American case? Does that give some hope for change elsewhere in the world? Just to try to tie the two together. And sorry to...
Again, Francis, I'll just add to those. It's interesting listening to you, because I know most of your work has been on conflict. I remember when I was at Oxfam, the two projects that were the most successful for us was projects that we did in India which focused on gender, and it was the gender that brought people together and made it more than just a development project. And the same thing in Latin America when we were dealing with indigenous people. It was the fact that they were indigenous people that brought them together. And I think it's besides being a very important concept in terms of inequality for conflict, it seems to be an incredibly important concept also for development to work over time. And I think that's an area that I think needs some more work too, as concepts that tackle not just inequality, but tackle effective development strategies, build on that inequality. Identity.
Let me just throw one last question in with this group, because I think we should probably wrap up after this. There'll obviously be a chance to talk a little bit afterwards. But to bring us back to our original theme, which is development in hard times, we actually wrestled a little bit with that theme, or debated it a little bit within the Global Development Environment Institute, because indeed these are hard times, and development needs to happen in hard times. On the other hand, we're in a different era than we were, say, 10 years ago in terms of development economics, in the sense that there is somewhat of a resurgence of development economics. And I think the ideas that we're seeing today in developing countries in particular are much more, are informed very much by the kind of thinking that Albert Hirschman and Francis Stewart have offered to the world. And so I'm wondering if you could both say something about sort of what you think of the state of development economics today in light of the Hirschman legacy in particular.
May I, Tim, may I jump in with just
here.
one piece to this? Because
Yeah.
Francis had mentioned migration, and it's relevant, I think, to ask all of you to think about how climate disruption is a hard time variable, and it's the climate justice movement worldwide that is also trying to address these issues because of inequalities, and I'd be interested in those reflections.
Yes, I think I want to start by making your book more important than you made it sound. because I think that what's exciting about Hirschman is that he looks at things with fresh eyes in a way that we are not taught in conventional departments. And what I think will be good is if your book is read by young people, that they would think, yeah, we can open up this issue. We don't just have to accept the concepts that were handed down in the textbooks. You don't have to accept Hirschman's concepts either. That's not the point. The point is to look at things with fresh eyes and see what's really there. And I just let me put that together with what do I think about development economics today. I think what's so good is that so much, as you say, so much more is happening in developing countries. They're thinking about their problems themselves. And what we're doing is, is not so important. And as a result, they're thinking about the problems that confront them, and they're not thinking about non-observed facts. They're thinking about actually observed facts, and inspired by these observed facts, they are reacting. I mean, not always. They've got all the sort of heavy burden of all the stuff that we've given them, but they are beginning to open it up because they see it as it is. So if you take my topic, horizontal inequalities, it doesn't, it's very unusual for development economists to talk about it, but if you go to Malaysia, it's unusual for them not to talk about it, and they do it all the time, and they have policies, and they understand the whole issue, and I could tell you many. In Brazil, they understand the issues, and so on. So I do think it's exciting because it's being done where it's happening, and so people, like Hirschman went to Colombia, and that opened his eyes. So many development economists, I used to have asked development economists, what are they studying? And they said they were doing an exercise on choice of technique in the textile industry in let's say, Colombo in Sri Lanka. And I said, oh, that's an interesting place to go. How did you find it? Oh, we don't go there. We've just got a data set. And you said, so much of development economics is done like that, which is just where you don't, it's non-observed facts in a way. It's just data mining. Now, what about the other issues? The gender issue is a really fascinating issue. And the point, the group is much more sort of dense if it only interacts with itself. And indeed, Blau, a famous sociologist, really defined a group as being defined as having more interactions with itself than interactions with the outside. But there are some identities in which that is not the case, that you do interact with yourself, either genders, but there are a lot of cross-cutting identities, and so you overlap obviously with your family, with men, with your, And as a result, it's a much less dense group. Now, of course, there are feminist movements and so on, which make it a more coherent group. But it is never going to be the same as, say, an ethnic group in Nigeria, which maybe hardly ever sees anybody outside that group and speaks to them and socializes with them and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of different type, but it's also an important group, but it's obviously different. And then there was this interesting idea that if there's intra-group inequality, the elite will then become friends with the elite and the other guys and leave and create a new inequality. And there may well be something in that, but it's interesting. And I quote here, I return here again to a sort of Nigerian example, where we were at a conference and we were overhearing some of the Nigerians from different ethnic groups talking to each other, and they were all elite. And they were obviously friends, and they went to each other's weddings and stuff like that. And at the same time, when it came into the open conference, they were obviously an ethnic group. And in politics and in analysis, they were not identifying with their friends who they go to weddings with and things like that. So yes, you have, it depends on the nature of the identity, obviously, but you cannot very often have what you're saying, the elite meeting the elite, but they don't necessarily form a tight group. Another example would indeed be the Holocaust, where the assimilationist Jews in Germany, who they thought they were assimilated, and many of them had intermarried, but the others didn't think they were, and for their own reasons, So I think it may happen, and I think this whole area is very interesting because there is a lot of fluidity and endogeneity and things which one needs to study. On the issue of democratization and the indigenous people in Latin America, I think democratization has been important in several senses. It's left space, it's given space for collective action. And without democratization, you didn't really have that space. And there are groups and people who've taken hold of that space. We can turn to Chavez, for example, or Morales. Both of those were supported by great movements which had used space. I know that Chavez was originally military, but Morales came up through democracy. Lula came up through democracy. And the democracy had given the space for the movements and so on which had supported him. So that's one very important way in which democracies help things. And connected with that is the fact that the democratic regimes really have been much more pro-poor than the previous ones. And if you're pro-poor in a society in which the indigenous are the poorest, then you obviously help the gap. But having said that, there are still huge gaps. And there's still a lot of racism. In Peru, for example. And we did a lot of work in Peru in my center. And the persistence of the inequalities in Peru are huge. In Guatemala, we also looked at. And there's been some attempt to correct the social inequalities. So, for example, on education and health, but the economic inequalities have still been exploding. So it's not all good news, but at least there is space for the indigenous people to try and take collective action. Interesting point, John, about identity as a development input, which I shall think about. I haven't any comment. And I'm sure that there is a lot of interesting work to be done on climate disruption and groups, but again, I haven't done it. Thanks.
So I'll make three, I guess, concluding points here. One on groups and one on democracy, and then one on questions of legacies. So first on groups, I think. So I'm representing Hirschman here, right? So I think he would say the word that he would use is polyvalence. That it can mean different things in different contingent circumstances, and to have one notion of groups as bad or groups as good is not going to be very helpful. Either way, they can stimulate some interesting ideas. So exit, voice, and loyalty itself was the result of something he observed in Nigeria, having gone down, chartered by the World Bank to look at development, which gave rise to a little book that was also overlooked called Development Projects Observed, which is a very interesting exercise, again, in observation and theorization. But it was at the tail end of the research in Nigeria that he saw the beginnings of what would eventually break out as a Biafran civil war. And so for him, the concern was how group identities get formed in the course of increasingly perceived inequalities. I won't go into a riff here about an important essay that he wrote about inequality, in which he coined, and I was thinking about it actually this afternoon as I came in, and when you go back to Logan Airport and you go through the tunnel to Logan Airport, that's where he coined the tunnel effect. We can talk about that if you want some more. So Nigeria was a negative case of how groups emerged to destroy development. The flip side was in getting ahead collectively was the story of how the Mapuches of Chile organized very effective strategies in the middle of the Pinochet dictatorship as Mapuches. And so group identities could also work the other way. On democracy, just a very small story, which is that in the mid-1970s, Hirschman pulled together a group of social scientists, Guillermo O'Donnell, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, many of the heavyweights of the remapping of Latin American social science, because he thought that it was very important that Latin American intellectuals reframe the debates for them away from underdevelopment or the causes of underdevelopment to thinking about development, away from thinking about the causes of authoritarianism to thinking about democratic outcomes. This, again, was in the middle of some very dark times in Latin America in 75, 76. And out of that emerged a whole network of a whole new generation of Latin American scholarship that tried to see in dark times what alternatives and possibilities existed as a precondition for thinking about democracy when it would finally come about. Hirschman had a line, a throwaway line in one essay in which he said, the first step we can make towards a transition to democracy is imagining it. And this comes to my last point on legacy. A recurring message from Hirschman, and I think if there's a message we can take away, and I'm sorry that I'm underselling the book, but is about the imagination of the intellectual, to think about alternative worlds. And it's one of the reasons why he kept coming back to literature and to Flaubert and Dostoevsky and others, because he found in novels and short stories and poems ways of finding cues for reorganizing observed facts. That we can make observations, but what they mean they can mean several things. But acts of the imagination are the prelude to acting differently and changing the world. And that in a way, that is the privileged space that intellectuals occupy. And so he was always very critical of the hyper-professionalization of disciplines in universities because for failures of imagination. So if there's a legacy, it would be to think about us as imaginers of alternative worlds, and that's the business that we're in, and go from there onwards.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our Leontief Prize lecturers today.